All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of O365A. In this episode, we're going to be talking about emergency services in teams, fireside chat with resident experts in 911 emergency calling services, Michael LaMontagne and Dino Caputo. Curtis, why don't you start us out with some questions for these guys?
Yeah, well, I think this is a good subject just because, especially with work from home, 911 calling, as it's known in North America, or just emergency calling, is top of mind. And of course, if you step back to Skype and link days, the basic premise here is if you have calling in Teams, you need a registered valid address in case there's an emergency call. And Microsoft Teams provides that, of course, under a couple different scenarios. So as I see companies deal with the challenge of work from home, one of the ways is to just try to get that valid address for the end user, no matter where they are, at home or roaming around. Michael, why don't you just kick us off, though, and tell us about some of the legal requirements around emergency calling in North America?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely an interesting topic to cover because of those legal requirements. So in Canada, when we think about enhanced 911, we are thinking about the nomadic SIP services. So we have a SIP trunk providing it to say Teams, Skype for Business, or any PBX or phone system. And so what the law is that you have to, on a phone number by phone number basis or a DID, you have to have a registered address. And so what will happen is when you get a phone number from the PSTN network, you've registered what that address will be for that number. And when someone holding that number calls 911 or emergency services, there's a PSAP intercept. So the intercept is basically like a call center that's going to say, hey, we have a screen pop. This is the number that we have registered for that address, or that registered address for that number. And then it's going to confirm if that location is correct. And if it's not correct and you're able to speak, then you can update that kind of on the fly, and it'll be dispatched to the correct emergency services. If you can't speak, at least in Canada, the emergency services will be dispatched to that registered address. So it is critical to have that registered address as correct as possible. Now, keep in mind that this is, usually in a number database by the 911 service. So there's, ways to hook into APIs and have user updating portals and administrative portals to update that information. But it's only as accurate as the last time it's been updated. So it's not dynamically updated in any way. So that is kind of a limitation that's happening in Canada. Hopefully, as the 911 systems get upgraded in Canada, we'll have some of the features that are available in the US. When we talk about US, we still have that same registered address on a per phone number basis, but we do have the ability to send through the SIP signaling PID flow. And so this is the ability to provide an XML document of emergency location information right up to the PSAP provider. So now live during that call, if your client or your endpoint is able to pass or detect the correct information, it can update the address information so it's not just that registered address. And so there's a lot of laws in the US that are driving this functionality. There's state laws like Kerry's Law that came into effect in this year. There's the Raybom Act that's coming into effect next year. And then there's state laws. So every state has different requirements of being able to, like in Illinois, being able to isolate a location within 40,000 square feet. And in Michigan, it's 7,000 square feet. So there's a lot of requirements to have not only 911 location information, but accurate down to certain locations within a larger campus or scenarios like that. And so Microsoft Teams is, obviously trying to adhere to all these laws. And so some of the items within Kerry's Law is the ability to do notifications. So someone calls 911, we need to notify another party that a 911 calls happen. So maybe it's the help desk or the security desk. And so Teams has this built in where you can do an IM notification to a group of people. It could conference in through the Teams client, a group of people into the 911 call. So that's how Microsoft's adhering to some of those legal requirements.
Right on. So maybe, Dino, why don't you tell us a little bit about what Teams has natively in it today? A little bit sort of add on to what Michael was saying. Like after we have, the location for the registration, what do we need to do with it, right? And how do we apply it and maybe manage those type of things?
Yeah, sure. So I guess once you decide on whether you're using calling policies or you're using direct routing, or maybe it's a combination of both, you still need to go into the Teams admin center and set up emergency policies. So you'll come in, and much like Skype for Business, where you had to set up the location policies and things like that for 911, you could do the same thing in Teams. It's not as robust as it was in Skype, and I think more and more features are going to be coming to sort of get it on par. But basically, you're setting up emergency calling policies and call routing policies to deal with 911. So talking about calling policies, you first of all have to define like what it is you're dialing. So if it's 911 or 211, like what are the digits or the strings you need to define to make a 911 call, and then you're assigning those policies to people. As well, you can decide whether you want to send a notification to a security guard or to a health and safety officer within the building. So you can like send a notification, or you can conference in that an individual but have them muted, or you can conference them in and have them unmuted in the call. And so that's kind of interesting. So again, you could do this similarly in Skype for Business. So those are really your options today in terms of the calling policies and emergency calling policies in Teams. So just as a quick overview for that, just so everyone's aware.
Yeah, and I think a critical item to that architecture of setting policies to go out certain voice routes is you need to define address information, right? So in your tenant, you need to upload your trusted IPs, which are your managed networks, public IPs, so both IPv4 and IPv6. So, hey, the Teams client has detected a network change. It knows what its public IP is. And based on that IP, you know that that's a corporate managed network. So you know what the subnets are behind it. And based on those subnets or switch ports or wireless access points, you're able to narrow in on certain locations or places within a location. That's critical for this architecture. So there's a lot of upfront planning, and if you have subnets that span buildings and locations, it starts to get pretty complex to kind of make this hierarchy. But then, like Dino was saying, those emergency voice routing policies can say like, hey, I'm in the Chicago office. I'm going to use this SVC that has a PRI line for emergency services, so that I could pass ELIN information to the PSAP and bypass that intercept call center service and get right to the local emergency services. Also, in addition, if you weren't using those emergency routing policies and you were detecting the location, the benefit of direct routing is we can pass that address information and those XML documents through the signaling. And you can have a third-party 911 emergency service provider that can be tied to your session border controller through direct routing. So things like Bandwidth or Intrado or Red Sky is no longer validated, but a provider like that they could take that. You would route an alternative path on the SBC for emergency services. They'd go to that provider. That provider has a database to validate those addresses that are coming in and dispatch the emergency services.
That's really for a managed network. Let's talk about, again, work from home and that nomadic scenario where people are roaming all over. What are some good options, both Dino and Michael, you've seen for companies being able to allow their end users to have a valid address for those types of scenarios?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and there unfortunately isn't a great solution to deal with that today. And I think that's areas where hopefully Microsoft's working on that. I don't know if folks recall in the Skype for Business days, if you had enforced emergency location dialing, it would pop up on your client if it didn't detect the network you were on, like you were at home, and it just 192.168.1.10. It would say, hey, this network's ambiguous. Can you put in your location? And it would update the Liz database in Skype. So I think we need something similar for that in Teams, and hopefully that we'll see that soon. What I'm seeing, at least one of my larger customers do, is that they created their own database structure that effectively allows a user to sign into a portal. And once they sign in, they use their Microsoft credentials to sign in, and then that by doing that, it's a unique identifier, and then it can go into AD and pull that user's phone number and say, okay, this phone number is now associated with this new address that user goes in and updates. So that's fine, and then that address in turn gets pushed out to the PSAP, like Northern 911, for example. So it may sound ideal, but the issue there is it breaks down if that the user forgets to go and update their location, then it's only as good as the information provided. So it's no different than anybody buying a standard off-the-shelf VoIP service today. That VoIP provider is telling them, like, you need to make sure you update your address if you move or whatever, because they're just going to rely on the last known good location. So again, these are interesting scenarios and solutions that you can implement, but you need to get the user to do that information. That's why, if at time of client sign-in, imagine the Teams client popping saying, this is the known location I have for you, and it's your home address. You're like, yep, I'm good. But maybe you decided to work from the office that day, and then it'll either detect that you're on the office subnet, or if it's an unknown location, it'll pop and say, I have you working from home. Is that correct? You're like, no, that's not right, and you have to update it. So I think something that's in line with the client would obviously make things work better.
Yeah, I would just add on to that. So like Dino was saying, I think the best solution we have today is a user portal to update that registered address. Otherwise, it fails over to the registered address. Or, if you have the ability to speak, then you can obviously confirm the address or update it. But if you can't speak and you're dialing emergency services, that pre-registration is definitely critical. I know that some of the service providers in the US, they may have a client-side app to do the updating of location and stuff like that. So if you looked at the bandwidth or Toronto or Red Sky, they have, there are other ways of updating that emergency services. But if we're looking at a native solution with Teams, I would say that RABOM Act in the US that's coming into play in January 2021, I think that would be a big driver for Microsoft to build that functionality, at least in the United States. Unfortunately, no matter what solution that Teams is capable of doing, it is going to be to that region's capability on the emergency services side. And so if we're looking at Canada, I still think in Canada that even if you could do valid addresses within the Teams client, the facilities for the 911 services to accept that on demand is not there yet. So I would say that anything that is going to get built into the Teams client, the United States is going to benefit first, and then hopefully other regions will, accept the next gen emergency services or 911 stuff that Dino was talking before the podcast, where everyone else kind of upgrades their infrastructure to be able to take that dynamic address information through the signaling of the call.
Yeah, and it really is a difficult problem to solve if you picture the user scenario of how many times have we signed into Teams somewhere and then moved mid-meeting sometimes. So it's really, really difficult to update that information. And Michael, you made a point before we hopped on this podcast. Cell phones in some way aren't really necessarily better, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the funny thing is most organizations will say, hey, we give everyone cell phones, so maybe we won't be so concerned about 911 location information in Teams. But even on a cell phone, that, you know, of course, everyone has a cell, or maybe everyone has a cell phone, but when you call 911 or emergency services from a cell phone, you're going to be, you know, only pinpoint within certain radius of a tower. So if I'm in a highly dense, downtown area and there's lots of towers, you know, they might not be able to pinpoint even what tower you're in, let alone what floor or what elevation you're at. So I wouldn't say that you're not going to solve this scenario just by working around it easily. There's definitely a lot of planning and communication. I know in Canada there's lots of like acceptable use policies of like, hey, if you're going to call emergency services through a software-based client or a soft phone, you need to know, that these are the limitations of that. I'm not sure what that looks like in actual implication. What happens if there is a vent and it's the wrong address and stuff like that. I would not want to be in that scenario, but it is definitely interesting how organizations are tackling it. I know Dino has a perfect example where they just want to remove the whole nomadic experience from emergency services. And maybe, Dino, you want to talk about the 911 red phones and stuff.
Yeah. I worked for a large organization that had a requirement to actually have dedicated 911 phones in user areas. So they there's no law in Canada, at least for this, but they as an organization, they chose to have phones from a health and safety perspective installed, no more than 50 meters from any one user. So it's like there are a bunch of neighborhoods, and every neighbor had at least 2 of these devices, and they were mounted physically on the wall. And what we did there was a bit of an interesting scenario. So the devices were configured just like you would configure a standard emergency phone in Skype or Teams. And we hard coded the numbers with the, in this case was direct routing or SIM trunking for Skype. We hard coded that location with the provider so that when any number was called or 911, they would see the full address, and then we use the suite field to indicate the location of that room. So these buildings all had a 6-digit alphanumeric location, so that you could tell, they were in this city, they were in this building, and they were in this room. So it could be anybody that had that code would exactly know in the building, even though there were like 5,000 or 6,000 people working one location, you would know exactly where that call was coming from. So upon a 911 call, both, the PSAP would pick up the phone and they would validate the address. And then at the same time, the security guards were notified through a SIP notification. And it would say, BRA 1234 SP is making a 911 call. So that was great, because then the security folks could know where that was exactly. They had a map that showed them exactly where that call was coming from. So kind of an interesting workaround, but in the event where you have it, and a lot of organizations do want to have these phones on walls, and it's more of a health and safety thing, and because they're worried about people not being able to unlock their PC to make a call, for example, and maybe because of the cell phone or mobile phone thing. So they go the extra lengths and they put these phones on the wall, and because of the fact that they're non-nomadic, they're not moving around, we can hard code the location, and we don't have to worry about subnet changes and things like that, because that location is going to be hard coded to that device. So
yeah, and I'm seeing that in the US as well. So in the US, if you have a dial pad, you need to be able to make an emergency call, and you need to be able to do that without having to dial any like external access digits or any kind of codes to get to that emergency call. So you need to be able to dial 911 and get to emergency service. And so I was working with an organization that was rolling out, quite a bit of Microsoft Teams rooms. So the great thing with a Microsoft Teams room is, it's in a specific office or location, so it's a fixed address. And so they were using direct routing to provide the dial pad in these rooms. And so in their phone system infrastructure, they were using CER, which is Cisco's emergency responder. So all they did was they took the phone number for each of these rooms, and then they registered it into that CER database, the location. So for them, although Teams has the ability to be nomadic, for their integration, they were just enabling these rooms to have the dial pad. So they were able to do similar to what Dino was talking about, mounting a phone on the wall. In this case, it's a Teams room in a certain location. Now, keep in mind, if someone was to unbolt that room and move it to another facility, that information needs to be updated. And I think that's the critical item is, even with the 911 phones mounted on the wall, if someone signs in with that account at a different device or the wrong device or moves the device, someone has to be spot checking that the address information is correct. And that's a lot of work. Someone may do a new subnet or, upgrade switching or wireless access points. And so your location information is only as good as the reliance of that database.
Yeah, I've seen some organizations as well just go traditional and have an analog line, like Dino was saying, but hardwired to a wall, right, onto a wall, and it's not connected to any SIP trunking or any SIP services. It doesn't have any power requirements because it gets its power from the CO and stuff like that. So exactly where that phone is in the event of a power outage as well. I mean, that phone will always have dial tone, right? Because it's not being powered by your local by your organization as well. So a lot of really interesting stuff here.
Yeah, I think the one more item that kind of is another tool in this conversation is that survival branch appliance, right? So now you have a session border controller that is in a certain location with analog or some kind of PSTN service. The internet goes down, the Teams client is still able to make and receive calls. Well, now it can be routing through that local service for emergency services. So it'll be interesting to see how critical that survivability comes when we talk about emergency calling.
Yeah, I would say that having a fallback, like don't put all your eggs into one basket is common analogy, but have an analog line, in every building, for example, that just as a fallback in each area, if that's something that's critical for you. So just in case you can't make those calls. So something to consider for sure.
Yeah. Make sure you research your state laws and federal laws for sure, especially if you're in the US. They're very different per region. But yeah, once you're equipped with that information, then you know how you have to architect the solution.
Well, it's pretty clear this is a hot topic.
Yeah, right on, guys. Great. Yeah, I think great topic. A lot of really good information. A lot of things to look out for and be aware of and to plan for. So I think that was a really great chat that we had here. Thank you, Michael and Dino, for being the resident experts on this topic, because, when I ask the questions, I know where to go. So anyways, thanks everybody for listening in, and hopefully we'll catch you on our next episode.
Thanks.
Thanks. See you later.